provided with caviar, for God's sake. That was wonderful.
So we're going to gather everybody.
That's a remark.
Are you enjoying? You have chairs, guys. Grab a chair, get a blanket if you need it. Seems like this is called being around the campfire, is it not?
Everybody's terribly like.
They are.
We're all going to be Vikings.
We are. Now, who needs more warmth here? This will not be long, I promise. You have one?
Thank you.
Gang, I thought the... Bobby, that's fine.
Ja, jamen det skal jeg nok, det lover jeg dig. Jeg står og
Ladies and gentlemen, Bobby Kennedy is a man who could have lived a life without much failure if he wanted to and played in the world. And he has done what everybody would like to do in life, and that is live a life of courage and goodness and accomplishing things. And I'm honored he is here tonight, and I ask him to just say a few words to us. Bobby, thanks for being here.
Thanks so much. And I want to thank you for all the hospitality that you've shown me and my friend Wendy today, and it's been a treat for us to meet all of you and to be here. And please excuse my voice. Ramar had asked me to talk maybe about a little bit what's happening in the United States with the Obama administration and its energy policy. So, I'd been talking with the minister about what we can and can't expect at the summit here in Copenhagen. But let me just start by telling an anecdote about Obama and my own relationship with him. When I was 10 years old, I went to Africa with my uncle, Sergeant Shriver. My uncle John Kennedy was in the White House at the time, and Sergeant Shriver was the head of the Peace Corps and had a son who was exactly my age. I had had an obsession with Africa since I was little, and he took me there. And when I was there, we met a man named Tom Mboya in Kenya. And Tom Mboya was one of the leaders of the liberation movement in Kenya. He was regarded as the most likely successor to Jomo Kenyatta, who was the first president of Kenya. He was very close friend of my family's, and he was a labor leader who was against the kind of tribalism. He wanted kind of a left-wing democracy of the kind that Nyerere had started in Tanzania. His heroes were Mahatma Gandhi, Thomas Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln, Franklin Roosevelt. He had realized that there were very few university-educated Kenyans, and at the time of liberation, that was badly needed to have people who could run the country. And he had come over to the United States in 1959 and visited us at our home in Hyannisport when John Kennedy was still in the Senate. And he had arranged with 200 universities in the United States to bring students from Kenya, promising students from Kenya, over to the United States to study in our universities and to be educated and then go back to help run their country. But he couldn't get the money to transport them from Kenya to the United States. And he was desperate because it was August and school started in September. And he had spent 2 days with my uncle, who was so charmed by him that he did something that he was very, very unusual, which is he wrote out a $100,000 check to bring these students to the United States. And it became known later as the Kennedy Airlift. But Tom Mboya was a luau. He was from a smaller tribe in Kenya, from up on Lake Victoria, the fish-eating tribe, that is known for being peacemakers and very intelligent people. In 1968, when my father was killed in June, I was 14 years old. I went back to Kenya because my mother, all the older kids of my family, were kind of scattered around so that my mother could have some peace and get the little kids together. My sister Kathleen went to work with the Navajo in New Mexico. My brother David went to work with Cesar Chavez in California. I was sent to Africa, and I spent the whole summer, most of it with Tom Mboya. I left in August, and 2 weeks after I left, he was assassinated. And in 2004, when Obama had been recently elected to the Senate, he came to speak at the Democratic Convention, which was then in Boston. And after the convention, he came to Martha's Vineyard, and I was staying in Martha's Vineyard with a famous American comedian called Larry David. And we went out to dinner at a friend's house, and Obama was there. And I sat next to him. I asked him, he told me that his father was from Kenya, and I said, what tribe was he from? And he said he was from the Luau tribe. And I said, oh, have you ever heard of Tom Mboya? And he said, Tom Mboya is the reason I'm in this country, because my father was the first person brought over under the student program that Tom Mboya created. And so, we had talked about that issue, about my relationship with him, and I had developed a rapport with him. I supported Hillary during the first part of the campaigns because I have a very strong relationship with her for 12 years. The rest of my family supported Obama, and I was hoping that Hillary would get out sooner, but she's but I wrote a plan for an energy blueprint, which was published in Vanity Fair magazine. And the first time I saw Obama after the convention, when I was working pretty much full time for him, he came up to me and he said, I read your article twice, and I want to do this when we get into office. And so since then, I've met with pretty continuously with members of the administration, and the great thing about this president is that he understands that we're not protecting the environment for the sake of the fishes and the birds, that we're protecting the environment because we understand that nature is the infrastructure of our communities, that if we want to meet our obligation as a generation, as a civilization, as a nation, we've got to protect our infrastructure, the air we breathe, the shared resource of our society, the commons, the wildlife, the fisheries, the waters, the public lands, the landscapes that connect us to our past, to our history, that provide context to our communities, and that are the source ultimately of our values and our virtues and our character as a people. The greatest crisis, and Obama understands this, that we face as a civilization, as a race, humanity, is global warming. And the biggest challenge that we have is how do we use and deploy energy in ways that don't compromise the life support systems of our planet and the lives of hundreds of millions of human beings and the aspirations of our children. And in November of last year, Lord David Putnam gave this wonderful speech before Parliament when England was debating a cap-and-trade system that was designed to avert the most cataclysmic impacts of global warming. And in England, unlike the United States, virtually everybody accepts the science behind global warming. And everybody understands that it's a grim urgency and that government has to play a strong hand in addressing it. But there's still people, there are vested interest in others who say, we have to move incrementally, we have to move slowly, because if we move too fast, there's going to be grave dislocations in our markets and our economy. And Lord Putnam was addressing the concerns of that cohort. And he reminded Parliament that exactly 200 years before, the same body had debated the abolition of the slave trade. And at that time in England, everybody, virtually everybody, recognized slavery as an abomination, as a moral catastrophe for the British Empire, and that it had to be abolished. And the only question was how quickly. But there were vested interests again, and others who said we can't move too precipitously because slavery at that time represented 25% of the GNP of Great Britain, and it was the principal source of energy for the entire British Empire, free human labor. And they said if we abolish it outright, that the economy will crater. But after a year of debate, Parliament made the moral choice and abolished slavery overnight. And instead of collapsing, the British economy exploded as thousands of entrepreneurs rushed into that space to create new forms of energy, mainly mechanical ones, in an era that we now know as the Industrial Revolution, which was the greatest epic in wealth creation in the history of mankind. And the abolition of the slave trade had exposed all of these hidden inefficiencies that were associated with free human bondage. And today, we don't need to abolish carbon to understand that our deadly addiction to it is the principal drag on capitalism in virtually every country in the world. In our country, my country, we are importing $1 billion. We are borrowing $1 billion a day, mainly from nations that don't share our values, in order to import $1 billion of oil a day, mainly from nations that don't share our values. And this hemorrhage of $750 billion, $700 billion a year in American wealth have beggared a nation that, when I was a little boy, owned half the wealth on the face of the planet. We give every year in our country $1.3 trillion in subsidies to the oil industry. And if you have doubts about that figure, look at Terry Tamanen's new book, which is called Lives Per Gallon. Terry Tamanen just stepped down as head of California EPA, and he has meticulously and scrupulously inventoried these huge rafts of subsidies that we give to the oil industry, including, the direct subsidies like the oil depletion allowance and all these tax breaks, but the indirect subsidies, $100 billion a year that we spend on protecting the oil pipelines with the military in the Gulf, and hundreds of millions of dollars from health care and from lost crop production, all these other externalities. He doesn't include the war in Iraq, which is $4.3 trillion according to OMB, and which should be billed to their account. And he doesn't include carbon emissions, which also are huge costs that should be billed to their account. We give about almost $1 trillion to the coal industry, $500 billion to nuke. And these subsidies have formed the principal impediment to new forms of energy, more efficient, renewable forms, indigenous forms from entering the marketplace. We know that the nations that have decarbonized their societies, in every case, have experienced instantaneous prosperity. Iceland in 1970 was the poorest country in Europe. It was 100% dependent on imported coal and oil. The government of Iceland made a decision to decarbonize its society and did it very quickly, despite a lot of local objections. Iceland went during that period from the poorest country in Europe to the fourth richest country by GDP on Earth. Unfortunately for Iceland, they then spent all that money on bundled derivatives that they bought at 151 margins. Now they're the poorest country in Europe. Iceland it has strong fundamentals, and its economy is going to return, because today Iceland, instead of being an energy importer, is one of the world's largest energy exporters. It can't run lines across the Atlantic, so it imports bauxite from Jamaica, smelts it into aluminum, and sells the ingots in the world market, and that's its way of exporting energy. Sweden in 1996 decided to decarbonize. It closed 2 of its biggest nuclear power plants, slapped a $150 ton tax on carbon, and Sweden's economy has grown since then by 45%, and its energy has dropped by 9%. Costa Rica, or Brazil, decarbonized 18 years ago its transportation system. And as a direct result of that choice, Brazil, which today, while the entire world is experiencing an economic collapse, Brazil continues to enjoy the longest, most robust economic expansion in the history of Latin America. Costa Rica, I was with the president last night, decarbonized its transportation grid about 15 years ago. And as a direct result of that, Costa Rica today is by far the wealthiest country in Central America. And you can go on and on with these examples. But we have, in the United States, much greater geothermal resources than they have in Iceland. My home is completely powered by geothermal. Every home in my region could be powered by it, but we're one of the only homes that is. It's almost utterly unexploited. We have the best solar energy in the world. The Scientific American just did a study that showed that if you took 19% of the most barren desert land in the desert southwest, an area 85 miles by 85 miles, a fraction of the area that we cut down every year in the Appalachians to get at the coal, we have enough solar energy to power the entire electric grid in our country, today's electric grid. We have the best wind energy in the world. North Dakota is the windiest place on Earth. At sea level, we have enough wind in North Dakota, Montana, and Texas to provide 100% of the energy needs of all of North America, even if every American owned an electric car. We have an administration now that understands this, that is absolutely determined to decarbonize our society. The impediments, and that understands that we've got to harness these new forms of energy. The principal impediments that the Obama administration faces, number one, the big subsidies to the incumbents, to the carbon industry. And the way that they're dealing with that right now is through a cap and trade system, and we've talked about that, and there's problems with getting something very effective through Congress, but they're dealing with it. Number two, infrastructure. And I talked to you about this. This is probably the biggest problem. We don't have a grid in our country that can transport these new forms of energy. Our grid is antiquated. It's already overpowered. It's not capable of doing long-haul transports of electrons. So that and it's also misaligned. It doesn't reach the big wind centers in the Midwest. It doesn't reach the solar centers in the desert Southwest. And even if it did, a wind farmer in North Dakota could not transport his electrons, sell his electrons to New York City or to St. Louis or any of the big markets, because they'll diffuse before they cross the North Dakota border. So what we need to do in our country is spend about $150 billion. And a lot of this is funded in the stimulus package. But there's $20 trillion or $2 trillion that are already deployed, allocated by the local utilities to do this, to build a national grid that's a smart grid, that it can intelligently store and deploy solar energy at night, wind energy during the doldrums, that can reach into people's homes. And instead of turning on these very inefficient peaker plants, where most of the natural gas in our country is burned in peaker plants that are only turned on when we hit peak, and they're very, very wasteful, very inefficient turbines.
What's that?
We could actually, if we were able not to use these peaker plants, we could power 100% of our passenger automobiles in the United States. You have to turn the peaker plants on 10 days in advance and burn them to make sure that they're ready. Well, the new electric grid that we have, the smart grid, allows the utilities to go into people's houses and send a signal. I say to every customer in their utility grid, tell us the appliances in your house that you don't mind us turning off for 15 minutes. Your hot water boiler. If somebody turns that off for 15 minutes, you'll never know it. It won't drop the heat of water in your house by even a degree. Your electric toothbrush recharger. Your swimming pool recirculator. We have all these phantom charges in every home, and if somebody turned them off, we don't care for 15 minutes. So the utility now has the capacity to go into it. I was at the National Grid Laboratory in Denver a week ago and saw how this works. It's extraordinary. The utility, instead of turning on these peaker plants and burning gas for 10 days, which is like, it's so wasteful. It's like washing your dishes in VO Hennessy whiskey. It's a very, 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 wasteful use of an extremely valuable product. But instead of doing that, they send a signal through, as soon as they hit peak, they send a signal through the line that turns off the hot water boilers in 1 million homes. And you never have to turn on those peaker plants. Just by that one change, you save enough power to power natural gas to power every automobile in America. They can go into your car battery and draw out the energy. So that's one of the issues. We need to spend $150 billion building this smart grid. Number two, we need to align the grid so it reaches every American home. And we need to change the incentive systems in our country so that the utilities no longer make money by selling energy, but they make money by conserving energy. And we talked about that a little while ago, so I'm not going to go into it. But California did that. We forced California to do it in 1982. The utility in California no longer makes money by selling power. It makes money by getting people to conserve. So the utility goes to the Public Utility Commission and says, I want to install compact fluorescent light bulbs in every home in my utility district. I want to tear out every refrigerator and put in a refrigerator in every home, put in a refrigerator that gets 60% more efficiency. It's going to cost me $100 million. I want to make 12% on that, and the utility approves that, and the utility commission approves it. The utility can go out and do it. That's how they make money. Because of that, Californians' economy has increased by 82%, and their electric, their energy use has dropped by 4% in that same period. Californians now use half the energy. They use 6,000 kilowatts a year. The rest of us use about 11,000 kilowatts. So Germans, incidentally, use 3,500 kilowatts. So we've got a long way to go still. But that's one of the things that we have to do. The other thing is, right now we have 50 public utilities commissions, and this is what Obama is doing right now. We have public utility commission in every state. Each one of those commissions administers its own Byzantine and arcane set of rules that restrict access to the grid. So it's very difficult for anybody to get access to the grid. And this is a problem all over our country. You know, every farmer in North Dakota wants to put a wind farm on a wind turbine on his property. We have the capital deployed to do that from big companies like General Electric, like Warren Buffett, like T. Boone Pickens, like the groups that I'm involved with, the venture capital firms. We want to go up there and pay for the construction of those wind turbines. The problem is we don't have a utility that can carry we don't have a grid that can carry the energy. And the utilities restrict access, so it takes 2 years to get the permits to plug into the grid. And what the Obama administration is changing that so that we create a national marketplace that reaches every American home, that does what a market is supposed to do, which is to reward good behavior, which is efficiency, and to punish bad behavior, which is inefficiency and waste. What we have now is a marketplace that, because of these subsidies and because of other rules and regulations, is rigged to reward the dirtiest, filthiest, most expensive, most poisonous, most destructive fuels from hell, rather than the cheap, clean, green, friendly, and safe fuels from heaven. And we need to change that around. And, you know, I'm on the board of the biggest green tech venture capital firm in the United States. It's called Vantage Point. And one of the companies, we have 35 portfolio companies, one of the companies that I have that I'm also on the board of is a company called BrightSource that just signed contracts with California to build a solar thermal plant that will provide 2.3 gigawatts of energy a year. A solar thermal plant is not solar voltaics. It's a mirror farm in the desert. It's a turbine, like a turbine you'd see in a coal plant. It's suspended from a scaffolding, and it's surrounded by concentric rings of mirrors in the desert that are manipulated by computers to always shine sunlight onto that turbine. Within 20 minutes of the sun coming up in the morning, that turbine's at 750 degrees Fahrenheit. So a very, very effective way of creating energy. We are building that plant for 3/5. It's as big as any nuke plant in our country. We're building it for 3/5 the cost that you would build a nuclear power plant. We're building it for about the same cost that you would build a coal plant. And once we build it, the energy is free forever. When you build a coal plant, the big bills are just going to come in, because now you've got to go cut down the Appalachian Mountains, ship it across the country in rail cars, build roads that have 18 inches of asphalt to carry the coal. Then you poison every lake in America, which is where we are now with mercury. You kill 60,000 Americans every year with ozone and particulates. A million asthma attacks, a million lost work days. You destroy the Appalachian Mountains with acid rain. These are all part of the costs of burning coal. And the big costs come after you build the plant. But when you build that solar thermal plant, the energy is free forever. The photons are hitting the planet every day for free. All we have to do is pick them up and put them in the line. If you build an oil plant, now you got to go to Saudi Arabia, punch a hole in the ground, bring up the oil, refine it expensively, escort it across the Atlantic with the military, get in periodic wars to defend the pipelines over there, spill it all over Alaska, destroy our beaches, poison our children, poison the air, etc. Those are the costs of oil. If you build a nuke plant, now you've got to store the stuff for 30,000 years, which is 5 times the length of recorded human history. And how that can be economic is insane. It's just not. It's the most catastrophically expensive way of, boiling a pot of water that's ever been devised. So, but once you build that solar thermal plant, the energy is free forever. Now, if we build solar, we use 1,000 gigawatts a year in the United States. 450 of those are carbon. It costs to build wind or solar to replace them, it costs about $3 billion a gigawatt. So for $1.4 trillion, we have free energy forever in our country. 1.4 trillion, we can provide the entire electronic grid in our country. Well, that sounds like a lot of money, but we're sending 700 billion a year to Saudi Arabia. So for 2 years, we pay the whole thing back. Then we get 700 billion a year every year to reinvest in our economy. And we've done this before in our country. We built a national grid that provides a marketplace, a national marketplace where every American can become an energy entrepreneur. Every home can become a power plant. If I have solar panels on my roof, my home during some parts of the day is producing more energy than it's using. I ought to be able to sell that energy back to the grid and get market rates for it. Today, there's no state where you can do that. There's 36 states that will buy some of it, but none of them will buy all of it, and none of them will give you market rates. We need to turn every American into an energy entrepreneur, and we need to, create a national grid that becomes a marketplace. We did this before. In 1979, we built a national internet grid in our country that connected every American home to the internet. And in 1980, a year later, there were fewer than 500 networks in our country, and IBM said that PCs, personal computers, were a dead-end technology. Well, now everybody has a PC in our country, and guess what's happened to the cost of information, of bits and bytes? It's plummeted to almost zero. And in 1996, the same thing will happen to electrons as soon as we build a national marketplace for energy. In 1996, Bill Clinton built a national marketplace for telecommunications in our country. He told all the baby bells, we signed the Telecommunications Act, told all the baby bells, you have to open up your grid to the lowest cost producer is going to prevail in the grid. We built a national marketplace. And because of that, we had a telecommunications revolution in our country. And all these little gadgets that we now have, like iPods, are the offspring of that revolution. But also, what's happened to the cost of telecommunications? 2 weeks ago, I saw an advertisement on television by a telecommunications company that will provide 100% of long distance and local calls for $28. Well, that's almost free. I've paid $28 for a phone call sometime in the last couple of months. But this is what the future is. It's free telecommunications because we built a national marketplace with the right market drivers. And that's what we need to do if we do that with energy, we will see, this is what Obama believes, we're going to see the cost of energy drop to almost nothing. Now, last thing I would say is, in World War II, in 1929, just before the stock market crashed, the stock market was at 395 in our country. In 1929, 1942, 13 years later, the stock market was at 85. In 13 years, there'd been no recovery. Roosevelt had employed a lot of Americans and kept them off the soup lines and fed them, but there was no recovery of our economy. Then we had World War II, Pearl Harbor came, and Roosevelt made a speech to our country, and he said, we're going to build 50,000 airplanes a year, 25,000 tanks, a ship a day, and on and on and on. And people laughed at him. They said, this is impossible. No industrial mobilization of this kind has ever happened in history. But he went to Detroit, and he said to the automobile makers, you're not making cars anymore. You're making tanks, and you're making planes, and half-tracks, amphibious vehicles. And within 9 weeks, they had all retooled their plants. Within 6 months, we'd reached those goals. Within 12 months, we had surpassed them. And the stock market, we had 100% employment, and the stock market exploded. But back then, all of the things we were making were stranded assets. They were things that we were shipping over to Europe and blowing them up. So there was no benefit to our economy. But today, what Obama wants to do is to build pylons across the country and string wires and employ millions of people doing it, and to build turbines from Vesta and from other companies like that, and put wind farms, put turbines on every farm in North Dakota, Montana, Texas, etc., and to build photovoltaic cells and nail them to everybody's roof, spray insulation into every home in America, have full employment to create a new infrastructure for energy in the country. But once we finish building it, it's not stranded assets. It's an infrastructure that is going to continue to produce wealth for our country for many generations. And once we do that, we have free energy in our country forever. A lot of people say, oh, you know, $700 billion is a familiar number to our country because that's the number that we gave to the crooks on Wall Street to bail them out for getting us into this mess in the first place. And a lot of people say, well, that's going to take generations to pay back. But no, it's not going to take generations. It just takes 1 year with no foreign oil. And, you know, we have that in our grasp, and we have the capacity to do this by creating this infrastructure. So I'm going to shut up now. And,
As you can tell, Bobby is not enthusiastic about this at all. Bobby, thank you. Danny, we're going to build up the fire. There's dessert right there. It's warm inside. Warm up. And if you like dessert, it's going to be sitting over here right now. Alternate and switch around and get in the fire a little bit.
Oh, very good. I'll do the best I can to make it look very nice.
well,
Yes, yes.
you know,
What he-